Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second episode of KATA Connect. Today, I'm joined by two very special gentlemen. One is Sal Mercogliano, the founder of the YouTube channel, What is Going On with Shipping? And I'm also joined by Dr. Angelos Katsaris, partner director at Avask. How are you, gentlemen?
Thanks for having us.
Very, very good. I mean, first of all, let's have a little bit of personal introduction from you, Sal. I know you are an expert in shipping. Kind of want to know your background and exactly what you're trying to achieve with the YouTube channel as well.
Sure. So I'm a former merchant mariner. So I sailed ships for 7 years, worked ashore, went into academia. So I got a master's and a PhD in maritime and naval affairs. Since then, I started contributing to G-Captain, which is an online maritime journal. And then in 2021, I started the channel What's Going On with Shipping. Initially, we started with the grounding of the Ever Given and following that. But since then, we really morphed into examining and discussing what's going on with shipping globally and really providing people with the context of an industry that most people don't know anything about. And even those within the industry don't communicate very well. So really trying to make shipping accessible to everybody.
Yeah, it's Angelos Katsaris here. I'm the professional service director and partner for Avask, and also very much involved in KATA Global Logistics, as it is our sister firm in terms of like international shipping and logistics. For me, I have a genuine interest because I know that a lot of e-commerce sellers are impacted by these ongoing events in worldwide. So I wanted us to have more or less like a quick update because we're in the middle of the Chinese New Year. It's a bit of a transit period, I would say. So it's great having Dr. Mercogliano today to give us a little bit of an update on what's the status internationally as well with the shipping situation, and we'll take it up afterwards more from a business point of view for e-commerce sellers and beyond.
Yeah, that's great. I think from what we really want from Dr. Mercogliano, I'd say, is use obviously his expertise of the current trade in the world shipping. So that's definitely what we want the rundown of and what's going on. So you'll be going through a presentation of what is actually happening. From our perspective, from Angelos and I's perspective, we kind of want to understand the examples and the alternatives that a lot of our clients have been using and what has actually not just looked effective, but also cost effective for our clients. So if we can have the presentation and Sal, you go ahead, that'll be amazing. I'm really, really interested to see what you're going to say.
Well, thank you, Pierre. I appreciate that. One of the things we've been witnessing, especially over the past 3 years that I've been running my channel, is a series of events that have been impacting global shipping, sometimes referred to as black swan events, but events that have had a massive impact on our ability to move goods around the planet. And obviously the one that's got a lot of attention right now is what's happening in and around the Red Sea, where we're seeing a series of attacks initiated by the Houthi. The Houthi are basically one part of a three-way civil war that's been going on in Yemen since 2011. Now, the Houthi have staged attacks on vessels in the past. We saw attacks on military and commercial vessels in the 2010s. However, what we saw happen starting in November of last year, 2023, is a concentrated attack against vessels moving through the Red Sea, the Bab el-Mandab, and the Gulf of Aden. They are doing this in solidarity with the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. This all happens as a result of the October 7th attack out of the Gaza Strip by Hamas, a terrorist organization with connections to Iran. This has in turn led to Israel invading the Gaza Strip and has led to a very bloody war that has been going on since October. The Houthi have decided to initiate attacks initially against Israeli-linked vessels, but that has morphed into attacks against literally almost any vessel. They try to make connections to this, but largely it's been pretty random attacks against vessels. And the result has been damage to vessels. This is a bulk carrier. This is a Graphia You can see the exit wound of a missile strike that hit this vessel. This vessel is in the Suez shipyard getting repaired. We've seen some very dramatic attacks on vessels, hits on board ships. There was a massive fire on board a petroleum carrier, the Marlin Luanda, that has severely damaged the vessel. Fortunately, what we have not seen is a loss of a ship or the injury and death of a crew member at this point. But what this did do was trigger the global shipping firms to react. So back in November, in December, when the escalation of attacks increased, we saw an announcement on December 15th by Maersk and Hapag-Lloyd, two of the largest ocean carriers, that they were going to divert their vessels out of the Red Sea and start heading around Africa. That began a wave of the large ocean carriers following suit. And that means that the big ocean carriers, particularly the container liners, have all taken their ships out of that east-west route between Europe and Asia and are now heading through this much longer voyage around South Africa. This shows you where ships are kind of positioned around the world. And this route adds a substantially longer voyage to any ship voyage. It's 3,500 nautical miles around Africa. You're talking about adding 7 to 14 days, depending on where the voyage originates and where it ends. And this is, of course, increased freight rates across the board, everything from twice to 4 times as much, depending on where ocean cargo is going. Now, the reason for the diversion isn't so much due to the damage being inflicted on the vessels, but because of costs associated with the vessels sailing through the area. All the major ocean carriers, particularly the large container ships, are extremely expensive. We're talking about ships of hundreds of millions of dollars, in some cases close to $500 million worth of goods and ship. And when you're paying a 1% war risk insurance on top of that vessel, it makes sailing around Africa just more cost effective than sailing through the Red Sea. Now, this has in turn been a problem. While we've seen diversions in the past around the Suez, 1956 and 1967 and 1968, what we haven't seen at that time is the massive increase in the amount of goods that travel around the world. Go back to 1980 and we're hauling less than 50 million TEUs, 20-foot equivalent units around the world. Well, now we're hauling almost 900 million TEUs. So this is having a massive impact on the movement of cargo. These longer voyages mean elongated ship transits, which means that ships are arriving later. They're arriving out of sequence, out of schedule. That's putting a lot of pressure on ports. The normal route that ships would follow to offload and load containers is now being shelved, and new routes are being established. And what this has is a knockdown effect down the entire global supply chain. Empty containers that normally would be back in Asia to be reloaded in time before the Chinese New Year were not positioned in time. And so we're just seeing this entire effect resonate through the global supply chain. And perhaps one of the most important things to remember is that the Red Sea and the Suez is not the only place we're seeing disruptions. We are experiencing extremely low water in the Panama Canal. Back in 2016, we opened a new lane of the Panama Canal, the first new lane since 1914. This meant much larger ships can now go between the Atlantic and the Pacific. Prior to 2016, you can bring a ship through the Panama Canal that maybe can carry 4,500 boxes. Today, you can go up to 15,000 boxes. But due to the low water, what we've seen is a twofold impact. Number one, about 2/3 of the number of ships normally going through the canal are being permitted through. So we're down from 34 to 36 ships down to 24 vessels. And even the vessels that are going through, particularly the large Neo-Panamax vessels, they're forced to raise their draft, which means cargo has to come off. And either of those ships are arriving at the Pacific side of the Panama Canal in a lighter condition, or they're going to have to offload. Maersk announced a decision to do this. They're going to offload part of the cargo on the Pacific side. They'll rail it across, meet it on the other side, and load it back on before traveling to either Europe or North or South America. This has, of course, added surcharges on top of the normal freight rates. We're also seeing these large Neo-Panamax vessels take a new route. Previous to what we saw happening in the Red Sea, the decision was made by a lot of the ocean carriers to have their vessels sail from Asia through the Panama Canal, go to America, Europe, offload their cargo, and instead of coming back through the Panama Canal, which would take up a transit, they decided to send them back to Asia via the eastward passage, initially through the Suez Canal, but now they're routing south around the very southern passage around South Africa. And this is all causing displacement of global shipping. If we look at the information put out by the International Monetary Fund, and this is from the end of January, what we're seeing heading through the Suez Canal right now is about a 40% reduction in the number of ships. But more significant is perhaps the tonnage. The tonnage reduction we're seeing right now is about 60%. So all the large, valuable vessels, particularly those container ships above 8,000 TEU, are all taking this elongated trip around Africa. This is resulting in additional costs. Fuel in South Africa, for example, is much more expensive than you can get in Singapore, Fujairah, Rotterdam, or Houston. We're talking about $100 more a ton. This is adding costs. There's fewer facilities in South Africa for fueling, for reshuffling of containers. And so ships are having to do these much longer voyages, these unscheduled port times, and this is causing the havoc throughout the global supply chain crisis. So that's my presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions and get involved in our discussion here as we go forward.
Hey, Sal, thank you so much. I think that was such a good insight of the overall sort of situation. And I like how it's different geographies, actually. It's different locations that we've discussed, but it's all kind of adding up for shipping liners having to come with these surcharges. Angelos, is there anything particular that you thought about the presentation?
Yes, I would say, first of all, I think it's really important to note the fact that we have increasing, I would say, frequency of these kind of events worldwide, because we've seen that normally, maritime incidents would happen, I would say, quite sporadically, whereas the frequency of these kind of incidents has dramatically increased over the last few years, and it's quite important to note this, because it seems that everybody needs to be aware of a plan B, and it's important to be able to diversify quite swiftly if you have to be adjusting in something like something similar that we can actually notice lately. But also it shows that we live in a rather volatile climate worldwide in terms of like international trade. Of course, for anybody who wants to be a little bit more ahead of the game is being able to have all the options on the table and being ready to have those resources in the key, I would say, destinations that he would need support, but also those key players for their business or for their supply chain, etc. I would say these are the two key aspects that I would take away.
Yeah, great point. From my perspective, I'm gonna try and play the client and businesses that are using the shipping liners and trying and put myself in their shoes. And the very first question anyone will ask, and I'm sure, Sal, you've heard this question before, is when do we expect these things, the period to change? Especially as from what we have seen as a freight forwarding business is, as you've already mentioned, the prices are the highest they've been probably since the COVID and lockdown times. So I know it's really hard to predict. It's really hard to answer this question. But what do you think are the factors that would have to change to potentially go back to that status quo?
Well, I think two things. Number one, going back with Angelos just talked about, The thing we're seeing different here is, and the reason we're seeing so many frequency of disruptions is because of the volume of trade and the velocity of the trade. It's so much higher than ever before. So it takes just a small amount to disrupt what we see normally going through. And, you know, that chart I had that shows you the number of TUs, that's the reason we see such disruptions. In terms of what we're seeing right now, you just had Prime Minister Netanyahu come out and really reject a ceasefire. The underlying issue here is the situation in Israel and Gaza. And unfortunately, that does not look like it's going to resolve anytime soon, which means that these diversions can become more normalized, or at least this diversion around Africa will become more normal. Let's remember, when the Suez closed in 1968, it was closed for 8 years. And so we will adjust, but it does change the overall economy. But I think the other thing to make note of is even if tomorrow this ends, you're going to have a disruption on the backside to reset everything back in. So we're really looking at months of disruptions here that are going to be continuing on. And I think Angelo's made a very key point there is if you don't have the backup plans in place, that's the key, you know, being aware and having that opportunity to take advantage. Fortunately, closing of this route has an alternative route. There are other areas that this does not happen. And so I do think that we're looking at this for quite a long time in 2024. And even, like I said, it ends. It's not exactly sure because the Houthi are not a nation state. They're a non-state actor. And so they're not operating under the norms of normal nation states. And so it's very hard to get any control over them.
Yeah, from my perspective, what I've seen in terms of solutions is, and as I've mentioned this already, however, in terms of costs, we've actually seen especially if we use the Far East and China as a hub, in terms of movement of goods from China. Obviously, you have the route through South Africa, which is obviously adding days and times and fueling costs, as Sal has mentioned. We've seen a strong movement towards, especially to trade towards the US. It's still not as busy as it normally is. However, we've seen the rates, especially of going from the east coast of China to the west coast of the US, the rates dropping down considerably in some sort, because that's normally a very expensive route. So, shipping liners are trying to find solutions for businesses and trade. And one very odd one, which some businesses weren't really aware of, is, and Angela's already mentioned, is actually the rise of rail freight from China, especially towards Europe, which, it's an most environmentally sustainable option. The transit times are actually quite quick. You're looking between 15 to 25 days to Europe. So there are alternatives in place, and that's what we want to warn businesses about on how to operate accordingly. But I know Angela's actually just come back from China. What is more or less their take on the situation? What are they trying to push in terms of the alternatives that are in place?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, of course. I would say China is at the point whereby there is still high demand, but I would say the market has pivoted in the sense that there are more options, like rail seems to be a much more, I would say, prominent solution for anybody who wants to expand over to Europe. There's road freight, which is it's not as rare as we would expect, but it is definitely an option on the cards. And definitely the oversea, I would say, the shipping aspect of things by sea is sort of affected, and it is obvious that the more this situation is prolonging, the more we will see this shift towards alternative routes. Even air shipments seem to be much more in use from several carriers and even like shipping brokers in the space. I would say one aspect that I wanted to stress is that also Sal was, I think, in some similar scenarios, it is useful to keep an eye on some kind of sites or even keeping a closer eye, like in the Indian Ocean or in other key areas whereby there could be possible scenarios of kind of instability. Let's say, maybe I don't know if you wanted to share with us some key sites or some kind of options that we could be keeping an eye on the conventional kind of shipping routes, let's say.
Sure. So, I mean, one of the things, obviously, prior to this, the Black Sea was a big area where we saw a lot of instability between Russia and Ukraine. But right now in the Indian Ocean, we're seeing a lot. There have been incidents off the northern coast of, the western coast of India, up in the northern Arabian Sea. We're seeing a resumption of Somali piracy. Now, this piracy may be different than what we saw in the early 2000s and 2010s. It doesn't seem to be seizing ships to hijack them and hold them for ransom, but more in line with kind of in solidarity with the Houthi attacks. So that is pushing out some shipping further from the coast, which is adding some distance to it. You obviously have tension in the South China Sea between China and the Philippines. That causes a lot of issues. There's a very highly congested area for shipping coming through. And this goes to a larger issue with what China's been doing over the past 20 years, which is really developing alternative routes. And, when you mention the rail route across Russia, that's something that China has been developing for a long time. It's one of the reasons why we see China investing in the South Pacific. In case the South China Sea route closes to them, they will go an alternative route. Even Russia developing the Northern Sea route through the Arctic. We're seeing a lot of alternatives going through. They're expensive, but there are alternative routes that they're trying to have. And so, again, shipping is always trying to find, it's water on a sidewalk. It's always trying to find the crack to get into, and they will always sometimes do that. But it's important to note that one of the things that we have seen is there's very little notice when these events happen, and you have very short lead time to react to them to make immediate changes. Ever Given, no one had a heads up that a ship was going to go and block that route. Same thing with the Houthi. We had some indications, but no one foresaw such a large diversion taking place. And that's why it's really important to be monitoring and have that flexibility to change your routes.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, it's a great point, simply because I'm actually, so you don't know this, but I'm actually Sri Lankan myself. So I've been to Sri Lanka. The south coast of Sri Lanka has a brand new port that was funded by China, and it's a stopping point, especially right now. It's a stopping point for refueling, for everything that they need before they get to South Africa from the east coast of China. And you're right, they have developed the situation for a long time now.
I was going to say that on top of these kind of aspects, and maybe given the current situation, we always try to see as to how international traders would be, how they could actually mitigate this kind of risk. So maybe it would be useful to maybe give us some kind of insight on similar situations. What did we actually learn from similar periods of instability? How long did it take for the market to maybe stabilize? And I'm mentioning that because we see that some shipping rates are going up, and we have additional fees and surcharges. So more or less, what is the normal sort of time frame for back to normality and on the status quo? And if we don't see this happening anytime soon, like, what would be the best kind of advice and strategy for somebody who's involved in the international trade?
Sure. So, I mean, obviously, the comparison that everyone's making right now is back to COVID. And that was a much different event because it impacted all methods of transportation. You had an issue with basically too much cargo coming into a system and clogging it on multiple ends, on the port side, in the warehouses, on the road, on the rail, distribution. It was a problem across the board that you saw. Right now, you're in a very interesting situation because the big ocean carriers are actually flush with extra capacity. They have room on their ships, and they have new ships coming online. And so right now they can accommodate this easier. So while you saw a massive spike in the freight rates, for example, which was actually a lot higher, a lot faster than what we saw during COVID, it's also stabilized much quicker. And I think that's a big difference that you're seeing right now between these two elements. Where we saw disruptions, for example, in trade coming in and around Russia, when all of a sudden the large ocean carriers stopped going into Russia because of the Ukraine process. Well, they worked their way around that. And now there's methods to basically get cargo into Russia via feeders. And I think that's always the thing. The ocean carriers and global shipping will always find their workaround. And they're really good at doing that. And it usually just takes a period of time for it to settle out. And I think what we're going to see here, particularly post Chinese New Year, late February, coming into March, is we'll see a stabilization in the routes. We'll get a good idea where it's at. Now, that's going to be a big issue if it remains, because as you know, the ocean carriers renegotiate their routes from Asia to America for the beginning of May. So they're looking at those long-term routes potentially being a bit higher. Where you tend to watch right now are those spikes in the spot market rate, which affects a lot of your customers because of the e-commerce nature. And so, what we see are those fluctuations. If we can get into a normalized route, then that provides stability in ocean shipping. The problem you have is when you have shocks to the system. The system, as global shipping exists, isn't designed to take more than a few percentage point changes in distribution in terms of peaks and troughs. And when you have a big shock like you had here with the Houthi, it takes a while for it to kind of reset. We saw that during COVID, when we literally had not one event, but multiple events happen, and they really just didn't seem to stop. Here, it seems to be an isolated event. The fear, of course, is another event happens that causes a further disruption of the chain, instability in another region, or shortage or inability to use a facility all of a sudden. South Africa has a lot of instability, for example, where we're assuming South Africa is able to maintain this type of traffic and flow. If, however, we go back a year ago when they had port strikes and issues, that could create a potential problem.
And I believe that there are also elections soon in South Africa, which is a really interesting, it's a spanner in their works, because we want to see which party is going to be elected, and also what kind of position is going to be held towards this type of, in terms of international shipping, and if there's going to be any additional levies and charges. And yes, for me, my interest is, and I would say the key advice that I would say for anybody who is actually listening to us is, be very much ready to diversify, keep a close eye on international trade and international trade politics, and I would say, and updating, yourself on these kind of situations. And no event is a unique event. Every event today is highly interconnected with whatever is happening at the other end of the planet, and that's why selling and shipping internationally, it's all very much interlinked on what's happening at the local and at the global level.
I couldn't agree more, and it's amazing to see because everything Salah said I have seen on a practical basis in our freight forwarding business, simply because looking at the rates, the Houthi attacks, Panama, all of these more or less happen at more or less the same time zone, at the same time, and we've seen the prices soar quite quickly. But as we are starting to look into businesses trying to ship after the Chinese New Year, which normally affects costs anyway, we have seen the stabilization of the cost. It's still relatively high to the norm of last year. However, it has stabilized. We're not seeing fluctuations as of the month after, but it does affect, as Angelos has said, I couldn't agree more. All these events do affect world trade and economic trade. So it's an amazing. Thank you so much, Sal, for you and your knowledge. I couldn't recommend to anyone listening and watching this video, I cannot recommend any your what's going on with shipping, the YouTube channel anymore. The updates are so quick as well, and so informative, which is fantastic. Angelos, have you got any final questions for Sal?
Yeah, I would say probably my last point would be in terms of like world trade and shipping. Where do you see things for the next sort of 10 years, or do you foresee any kind of major shifts towards the way that we currently shape, let's say? And maybe if you can give us your sense check as well, that'll be great.
Sure. Just a couple of things I would say to be on the lookout for. So there's a big initiative being pushed by the International Maritime Organization to get more green in shipping. And so fuel costs, new fuel systems are going to be a major factor going forward. This is going to impact cost of shipping as these new fuels and these new propulsion methods come on. One of the unforeseen circumstances, for example, that we're having right now is this longer voyage. The EU, the European Union, just imposed a carbon tax on shipping. And now ships are sailing these extra distances. That's adding to the cost. Ships have to do report cards on their fuel emissions. You can't just speed up a vessel because you're going to have a negative impact on that. So I think looking at how ships are fueled, how they're propelled, is going to be a big issue, because we're going to see a big changeover in that. One of the reasons that some shipping lines haven't been very kind of proactive in changing out their fleet is because they're waiting to see what the right type of fuel is going to be. And that's a big issue. The other element we're seeing right now, obviously, is relocation of some assets. You were mentioning air transport, jet fuel. One of the things that's being displaced right now, having to go around Africa right now, is jet fuel. Much more expensive to get it. It's going to cause additional costs into that. And then we're also seeing a reshuffling of the big container liners. There have been, basically 10 big ocean carriers that carry 85% of the world's trade in 3 big alliances. The alliance system is undergoing a big change. We're seeing a reshuffling. We just saw the announcement of Maersk and Hapag into the Gemini Corporation. MSC is going to be on their own, but I don't think they're going to be on their own for long. They're going to get someone, and we may see what we saw in 2017 with a fallout and a collapse of an ocean carrier like Hanjin, for example, that found themselves on the outside. I'm not going to be surprised to see that happening, because what we're seeing is really consolidation into these bigger ocean carriers who are much more diversified. They're trying to do more in terms of ocean carrying. They're trying to do e-commerce. They're trying to do air transportation. They're doing land, becoming much more bigger entities out there. And it'll be interesting to see how the EU, the United States, and China handles these. The EU just recently repealed the antitrust exemption against the ocean carriers. That could potentially mean going against these alliances in some ways. So there's a lot going on in terms of regulations with the ocean carriers that I think you need to be informed of. And again, I go back to exactly what you said. You need to be very quick on your feet and being able to change to accommodate where your cargo is going. There was a couple of smart people I know who saw what was happening with the Houthi and sat there and put their cargo on ships heading to LA and Los Angeles, vice heading to Europe, because they realized that they needed to move that. And that's not just a matter of putting it on a ship. It's a matter of having the facilities, the agreements in place, and being able to handle it when it hits ashore. So again, this is a very complex issue, and it's one little thing happening around the world impacts things 10,000 fold down the entire system.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your knowledge, Howard. The final thing I wanted to ask you is, if anyone wants to get in touch with you and anyone wants to follow you, your Patreon or your YouTube, how can they do so?
Sure. So you can follow me on Twitter or X, whatever we're calling it now, at Mercogliano S with an S. My name becomes Greek on Twitter, so I add that S at the end. It's no longer Italian. And then you can follow me on what's going on with shipping. Has all my links on there on YouTube.
Amazing. Yeah. If anyone listening to this episode wants to get in touch with KATA Global Logistics to speak about your potential new strategy because of the disruptions right now, you can do so by emailing inquiries@katagloballogistics.com. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time, and I'll speak to you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.